Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to everyone in Delhi and online to the 7th Climate Solutions Forum. This year's forum is hosted by the Foundation's 20 platform F20, Dasra, and co-hosted by the Shakti Foundation. A very warm welcome as well to our network partners, AVPN, CAPS, and the Climate Rise Alliance. I am Kirti from Dasra, and I'm thrilled to be guiding our journey today. One Earth, one family, one future, resilience for all is this year's focus of the Climate Solutions Forum, obviously a clear reference to the overall motto of the G20 presidency as well. The organizing team today has managed to curate a fantastic set of speakers from all across the world, and the agenda includes a diverse mix of backgrounds and formats. 3 thematic blocks will be at the heart of our discussion today, emphasizing the responsibilities of key stakeholders in multilateral processes to take action to the world's biggest challenges and to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. Our first block, Resilience in Action, will discuss an intersectional response to the climate crisis. Our second block will talk about climate change, cooperation, and a just energy transition. Our final block will discuss the particular role that philanthropic organizations can play in multilateral formats such as the G20. So friends and colleagues, we are ready to get started, and it gives me great pleasure to hand over to the 3 F20 chairs, Neera Nundy, Klaus Milke, and Ilham Habibie to kickstart our journey. Neera is the co-founder of Dasra and leads the organization's ecosystem building initiatives in areas such as climate, urban sanitation, adolescence, democracy, and governance. Neera, over to you.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. So good morning. And on behalf of my dearest co-chairs, I wanted to welcome you to the Climate Solutions Forum, finally here in India. And thank you very much for making the time to come here. You know, Klaus and Ibrahim, I was reflecting that we actually first met almost a year ago in Munich. And if one just starts to reflect on the journey, I was like, wow, it was only 11 months ago that you so graciously, included us in your conversations on climate. And I felt that being invited was an opportunity to really share an Indian voice, and now to actually be here present in India. It's very exciting to see this momentum build for the F20, and wanted to thank you for including us in the F20. But when I got invited to speak there, I was rather intimidated. I must admit, the both of you are stalwarts in this space, as is the audience typically. And I was intimidated, but I was also rather disconnected. A lot of the global north discussions are on energy transition, fossil fuel, sort of this overconsumption. And you just wonder, especially when we hear at Dasra work with millions, whose ambitions and aspirations don't have access to electricity, internet, washing machines, toilets, or even food. But also a lot of the millions that we work with at Dasra also are questioning their livelihoods, health, the state of their city, and really their forests and oceans. And it began for me to think about, how do we bring more respect and a better understanding and really improve their conditions into this conversation? And so why isn't highlighting this need become a priority as well? And I think that space has really been created with the F20 and adopting that into really building resilience. And that was really BAM, where I realized that's the role that philanthropy needs to play. And that philanthropy needs to play an important role at the intersectionality of climate. So climate and health, climate in cities, climate and agriculture. And how do we really encourage that conversation, but also that investment and amplification that builds sort of community resilience? And with that, in the last 11 months, we've actually launched a platform called Climate Rise. So thank you for really seeding that. And it's gained so much momentum because there's a gap in being able to represent community resilience as it lends itself to collaborative climate action. And where is that community voice, and where is civil society playing a role? And that's really what we've been thrilled to begin anchoring and want to invite all of you to be a part of. So as we co-host this forum, I wanted to open with sort of a less gloom and doom, the world's coming to an end. It probably is coming to an end. But I did also want to say that despite, the Ukraine war, despite the wildfires raging, in Canada, and where climate scientists predict a lot more to be happening, or where we're all debating a loss and damage fund, I really wanted us to take an opportunity at this Climate Solutions Forum to think about, who's not in this room, who doesn't have access, who's not able to negotiate for all the vulnerabilities they are facing as it relates to climate, and to make sure that we're keeping in our conversations that at the very forefront. And so I just wanted to end with that it's important for us to bring them here, for them to be represented, and for us to recognize our privilege as it relates to building our collaborative and collective community resilience. After all, it's one Earth, it's one family, and it's one future that must shine bright for all of us and not just a few of us. So I hope we keep that all in mind today. All of this would not have been possible with the raging leadership of Klaus. And so I'll hand over to you, Klaus.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good evening for some of you on the screens, and good afternoon. Yeah, wonderful words from your side, Neera, and I'm so grateful for the partnership, the friendship we now have with you and your team at DASRA, but also with Shakti. Shakti, many people are here in the room, and they are the co-host of this event today. And what we are doing, what we are trying to do to bring in some positive ideas, some ideas solution-oriented, what can be done, what could be done, what should be done, not only from the heads of state of the G20 and from the finance ministers and the central bank leaders, but also from the different stakeholder groups in between of the societies of the G20. G20, why? The G20 play the eminent role for the world, and all the other states in the world are somehow victims of the G20. If the G20 will not move, there's no hope for the majority on the world, and very much also on the most vulnerable. You mentioned them, Neera, and to those who are the smaller ones and have no responsibility so much for CO2 emissions as the G20 states have. So there is some movement, and this movement needs inspiring voices. And one additional voice, since 7 years, we have on the table, that is F20, philanthropy and foundations. And they can play a role, they should play a role, and we try to reach out to much more. And that is wonderful with you, Neera and DASRA, that you have many contacts to philanthropic groups, families, and family offices in India, because they are also needed for the whole game, also for the situation, how to finance the climate crisis and also the biodiversity crisis. And I have here the button of the SDGs. Don't leave no one behind. That is the main narrative of the SDGs. So it has to be just and with global justice. And we in the global South are very much responsible for what is bad on the global scale. But we can and we should do it together with the emerging countries. So India now plays a key role. Last year it was Indonesia. You will take over very soon, Ilham. And next year it will be Brazil and then South Africa. So the global South perspective is so important for the main discussions we have now. And we in the North have to listen more, to learn more. What are the solutions in the global South countries? And so we are ready to learn here, to listen to you, Neera, and to Sunita and others now in the room as speakers for this event. So I hand over now to my good friend Ilham, because we have a continuity at F20, handing over from year to the next host country for the G20 presidency. And then there are newcomers from foundations to come on board. So that was the situation with Indonesia, and that was GATE. It was the same situation with you in India. But to continue in this, to get more voices, to get more action and potentials on board, that is what we try to do. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the friendship and all the partners now supporting this event. And now it's you, Ilham.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Thank you very much, Neera, as well. Yeah, my name is Ilham Habibie. I'm from Indonesia, and I'm right now the co-host here because last year, as Klaus already mentioned, Indonesia had the honor and the pleasure to host G20. And so an event like you have today here, we hosted last year in Jakarta. I think it was in September last year. I want to say something about the topic in India right now, which is one Earth, one family, one future. Last year, Indonesia had a similar theme called Recover Together, Recover Stronger. Because last year, most of the work was still in COVID. And so one of the main topics that we had during the G20 summit and the many, many meetings was how to basically improve the global health system so it would be really fair and just and effective and efficient, which is, thank God, this year, I think we don't talk about COVID anymore. I think I don't see one person in the room wearing a mask. But I think occasionally we still see some people like in airplanes, etc. But it's something, it's the past. So we have found a better future, I think, for all of us regarding the health situation. But of course, there's so many other topics to be discussed. One of them, as Klaus and Neera mentioned before, energy transition to make the world more sustainable. That means more renewable energy, etc., etc. This is a lot that we are going to discuss today, and all of that is also in connection to be seen with the climate, of course. So Indonesia is a country like India and most other countries that will enormously suffer if we don't do enough regarding the climate crisis. It's already a crisis, not a challenge anymore, it's a crisis. Indonesia is, for the ones that don't know where and what Indonesia is, we're an island state with 17,000 islands. And I think that many of those will not be there anymore. If we have a rising sea level of a few meters, then we will be less. Yeah, 70% of our country is water, 30% is land. The islands are not small islands, some of them. Some we have the second, the third, and the fifth largest island in the world are in Indonesia. So they're not small, but altogether, and Indonesia as a country is larger than the United States. It's from west to east, you fly like 7 hours or so. So it is not a small country. And of course, the relationship to India, well, you can see it in the name, right? Indonesia is the Indian islands. So that, I think many years ago, was coined by a scientist from Germany, actually. So Indonesia is related to India in terms of culture, history, etc., etc. And we face the same challenges. Yeah. So basically, our hope is that the continuity, as Klaus eloquently described before, can be supported, can be nudged into coming into reality by actions and by conferences like this. The small they are, doesn't matter, but the continuity makes a difference. Yeah? It doesn't matter to have only a group of people who are saying that there's not everybody here. It's never possible to have everybody here. But it's important to keep the continuity so it sticks in people's memories. And I think through everybody's network and partnerships that we have with other people outside this room, we can make it happen. But it needs patience, it needs consistency, it needs discipline, it needs continuity. I think that's all I have to say today. Thank you for being here, and thank you for hosting us so well in India. I'm really happy to be in this country, in this city. I've been here so many times, and I really love it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Neera, Klaus, and Ilham for starting the day. We are now moving ahead with our exciting program as we have a packed agenda of keynotes, panel discussions, conversations, and also a little surprise at the end. Again, a very warm welcome to everyone in the room and also joining online. It is now my great pleasure to introduce someone who, well, does not need any introduction when it comes to the climate ecosystem in India. A very warm welcome to Ms. Sunita Narain, an environmentalist, researcher, and writer who also serves as the Director General for the Center for Science and Environment. Over to you, Sunita.
Nobody will see my face. So Neera, Klaus, Stefan, thank you for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. As all of you know, and I think it's very clear, climate change is an existential issue. It is also the one issue that brings nations together. You know, on everything else, we can always stay divided because it is something on which we can say, well, you know, it really bothers you, doesn't bother me. Or, you know, whether it's the issue of poverty, the issue of many other issues that we care about, the world is divided. And let's be clear, getting even more divided. But on climate, even though in spite of the 30 years of intense negotiations, and we are still nowhere close to the cooperative agreement that we need to have, the fact is we have no choice. This is one issue on which we have to have cooperation. And we also know that global cooperation, because when we talk about climate change, we are talking about the global commons. We are talking about how each country has the right to development and how all of us have to live within the planetary boundaries. It is also very clear to us that cooperation will only come if you have embedded in it the principle of equity and climate justice. So when you talk about climate change, it's not a moral issue. It's not an issue that you can discuss after the fact. It is an issue which is absolutely intrinsic, embedded into what has to be an ambitious and effective agreement. We also have, and I think what this gathering is, the program, is very clear towards three major issues. One, the issue of resilience and the issue of action. It is very clear that in our part of the world, we are beginning to see massive impacts of climate change, as is the rest of the world. But it is the fact that the poorest in our world are the worst impacted. They are the victims of climate change. They have not contributed to the stock of greenhouse gas emissions. So we need effective action. We need effective action from the already rich world. And we need to do things in our own self-interest. Now, this is where the question of resilience and action and the issue of energy transition has to come in. So for us, when we talk about climate action, for us, the action is embedded within what we call co-benefits. What is good for us and how is it good for climate change? Most of us know, living in our cities, we have massive air pollution, toxic air pollution. And when you're dealing with toxic air pollution, one of the ways out of that is to change the fuel we are using, move out of coal, which is part of the climate change crisis as well, to move towards cleaner fuel. And in our case, it would be gas, which unfortunately the war in the world has completely derailed our plans. And that should be part of the conversation. But we need to move out of polluting sources of fuel we burn in our own self-interest. We also need to reinvent our mobility systems, go in for a transformation, not a transition, but a transformation. Because even if we clean up each individual car, we know that as we add more vehicles on the road, the impacts are negated. And in a country like India, and this is where keep in mind always the climate issue globally and how it connects to us. As much in the world where the world has to reduce because there are large numbers of people who still need access to energy. The rich have to reduce so that we get the right to grow. It is the same question in a city like Delhi. The fact is, very large numbers of people in Delhi still walk, still cycle. Now, there is no airshed space left for us to make sure that everybody gets onto a car. So you have to reinvent mobility. You have to reinvent mobility not because it is a cute thing to do and the way the rest of the world is doing it by moving them towards cleaner cars. We have to reinvent mobility so that it is affordable for large numbers of people and convenient for the rich. And that is a challenge we have because without that, we won't get our right to clean air. Now, that should be the same challenge in the world, that the rest of the world has to reduce because we need the right to grow. Now, this is where I believe the entire discussion on energy transition has just got it completely wrong. The fact is, in our world, we need the right to grow. We need development. We have per capita energy levels which are ridiculously low. This is energy, and the right to energy is a human right. You cannot deny that. And yet, in a speedily warming world, we are running out of the carbon budget. By 2030, there is no budget left for the world to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade. Yet there are large numbers of people in the world who don't have the right to energy, who don't have the right to development. That is unacceptable. So if you take the energy transition issue, it should have been discussed from the point of view of what does it take for countries like India, countries like Indonesia, to augment the new energy towards cleaner sources. Instead, the entire focus has been on existing coal-based power plants. And the fact is, we know today that without concessional finance, without huge financial transfers, our countries cannot make the transition. So that's what the debate should have been about. That's what the discussion should have been about. But that is why, and I will end here because I know my time is very limited, I will end here to say, but that's why F20 is important. Because F20 has to deepen the dialogue between the developed, the developing, between the rich, between the poor, between the north, between the south. Today, we are at a very bad time in the world, but the bad time is also because conversations are not happening. We are even more polarized than before. We are even more intolerant than before. So I think the most important thing as we move ahead is to stop having the conversation of the deaf and the dumb, and actually having a conversation where we can listen to each other. That, to me, is the most critical issue as we go ahead. So thank you, Klaus, for organizing this. I think this is really where the future has to be. The voices that come from the South have to have an equal space so that we can have a common world together. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to Sunita. We are now going to hear from another powerful woman. Helen Mountford is the president and CEO of the Climate Works Foundation. She brings over 25 years of global experience at the intersection of environmental action, economic development, and climate policy to her role. Before joining Climate Works, Helen was also the vice president of climate and economics at the World Resources Institute. Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor and a pleasure to join you here virtually at the F20. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but wonderful to be able to join you online for these really important discussions and this conversation, as Sunita said. I mean, this is what we essentially need. Now, we all know that this is a global emergency and an existential issue, as Sunita mentioned. Climate change, we must take all the action we can to urgently reduce emissions wherever possible. But we also must focus on the intersectionality of climate action and development objectives. How do we achieve these together to advance practical solutions that can address the impacts of climate change, that can build resilience, and can prioritize justice and equity? Now, from philanthropy, there is a strong track record of providing catalytic capital to really work closely with and support governments and domestic philanthropy, businesses and communities to support action on both achieving local development goals and tackling climate change. And there's interest to do even more together on this. At Climate Works Foundation, where I'm working, we're helping philanthropy to do more on climate, to do it faster and more collaboratively, and importantly, in a way that leaves no one behind. Some of the data that we collect shows that in 2021, global philanthropic giving to climate mitigation increased by 25% year on year. It grew much faster than overall philanthropic giving. So we're seeing a growth in climate philanthropy. But funding for climate change mitigation is still represented less than 2% of global philanthropic giving. It is far too low. And this is just the data we have on mitigation financing. This year, we're working together with partners to actually gather initial data on philanthropic giving for adaptation for the first time ever. Really critical that we have this data to understand what's happening and how we can advance action more quickly. Now, the focus of this session is really on building resilience. And many of the programs that we're supporting together with philanthropic community are helping communities to adapt and to build resilience to climate impacts, whether it is through transforming food systems in ways that can deliver food security for all, boost farmer incomes, and support ecosystems, or is through delivering access to much needed cooling solutions that don't in turn lead to even greater emissions and faster climate change. These are some of the solutions that we and others are supporting from the philanthropic community. Let me give a few examples. Consider extreme heat, which is putting a growing number of lives and livelihoods at risk every year. Cooling is increasingly a basic human need, yet over 1 billion people today don't have access to it. So philanthropy has collaborated with governments, with business, nonprofits, and local communities to expand access to affordable climate-friendly cooling, helping to build resilience for individuals and communities. There's a number of successful examples to turn to, including there in India. In India, the Mahila Housing Trust has helped over 2 million individuals gain access to affordable home cooling solutions through its women-led integrated approach to improving housing, living, and working environments. More recently, a government-supported effort with the Energy Efficiency Services Limited, EESL, has been announced, which will deploy 10 million energy-efficient fans, expanding access to cooling while reducing strain on the grid, and importantly, also saving households money on their electric bills. Another innovative approach that we and others have supported in philanthropy is the Million Cool Roofs Challenge. This was a global competition to increase the use of passive cooling techniques in hot countries where we see limited access to cooling now. The winning team, a team of from Cool Roofs Indonesia, had a result that benefited over 10,000 people with cool roofs on 70 buildings in 15 cities in Indonesia. They established ongoing production capacity, have created new manufacturing and installation jobs, and it's now going to a new scale of effort. One of the big challenges, however, we're seeing in cooling is getting the finance that's needed to support clean cooling solutions at scale. And philanthropy is leaning in here too. There's something called the Cool Capital Stack, which the Arsht Rock Resilience Center and partners pulled together. And it's helping to tackle this clean cooling financing challenge. They have $750 million in investment pipeline that is blending together capital, including philanthropic funds, together with concessional and blended finance, parametric insurance, and traditional debt and equity in order to boost investment in passive and mechanical cooling solutions for cities around the globe. So that's one of the ways that we're starting to see some of the financing stepping up as well to deliver these solutions at scale. All of these initiatives are partnerships bringing together various actors, the governments, private sector, local communities, and with some catalytic philanthropic funds to really help boost the action and to move things forward. We need these solutions and we need to take them to scale now. We also need bold and transformative action by governments, and the G20 can play a critical role in this. India's call at COP26 in Glasgow for a phase down of all fossil fuels is one that we hope will gain even more support this year as we go forward. And linked to this, governments, including the G20, should seize this moment to really live up to their commitments to move public funds away from subsidizing pollution, air pollution, climate pollution, and towards clean investments instead. Shockingly, taxpayers last year subsidized fossil fuel consumption and production by over $1 trillion in terms of direct subsidies or tax breaks to the fossil fuel consumption and production industries. That's $1 trillion of subsidies going to support fossil fuel consumption and production. All of that is leading to pollution, to health impacts, to climate impacts. That is also the same year, last year, is when we also saw fossil fuel companies making record profits of $200 billion from the soaring prices of oil and gas, affecting households and individuals. So we have this conundrum, and it's a moment when governments can really step up and actually tackle this, removing these fossil fuel subsidies. While stopping the financing for pollution, we also need to scale up the financing of clean solutions. To close the climate finance gap, the G20 and others can consider various innovative ways of raising funds for climate action and development opportunities in the global south. A few of the examples of these can include things like windfall taxes on oil companies, which a number of European countries have begun to start moving forward. It can also include advancing the discussions in the International Maritime Organization on a potential global carbon levy for shipping. Beyond these, we need to reform the multilateral development banks, the international financial institutions, to ensure that they're both fit for purpose to help us meet climate finance needs and the sustainable development goals. And this is an area where India's presidency of the G20 can really demonstrate real leadership as we move forward. India has already been leading the way on so many innovative approaches and solutions, which all of us can learn from to tackle the climate and the development challenges together. This includes things like the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the International Solar Alliance, and more recently highlighting how a range of approaches can really help encourage sustainable behaviors and advance climate action through Prime Minister Modi's Lifestyle for Environment initiative, the LIFE initiative that Prime Minister Modi has put forward and which others can build upon. These are the kinds of innovative, integrated approaches that we all need now, and that can help us to achieve our critical development objectives globally, particularly in the Global South, to help build resilience for people and for communities, and to help put us on track for our global climate goals. We have no time to waste. We can and must build on these successes and take them to scale. And philanthropy is here to help, working closely in partnership with governments, with academia, and civil society. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, for being live with us today despite the huge time difference. We truly appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. We'll now move to the first panel discussion of the day. Without further ado, I am delighted to hand over to Aparna Roy, Fellow and Lead Climate Change and Energy at the Observer Research Foundation. Over to you, Aparna.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Dasra, for inviting me to moderate such a critical discussion. So the way I would structure the conversation is that I'll start with a bit of context setting on what the issue in discussion is, and then I'll quickly go over to my panelists for them to introduce themselves very briefly and the work that they are doing in this area before we move on to important questions. So if we look at the recently released reports, in fact, if we track them since past 5 years, all of them, including the ones that have come out of IPCC or the United Nations Environment Programme's Adaptation Gap Report, have been painting a very disturbing picture. The science in the analysis is very clear that it projects that the impact of climate change are set to increase in frequency and intensity, even if we pledge to stop the global warming and halt the emission in the coming years. Developing countries of the Global South are the most vulnerable to these disproportionate impacts, despite having contributed the minimum to climate change. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC's report, Climate Change 2022, Impact, Adaptation and Vulnerability, currently around 3.6 billion of world's population live in highly vulnerable climate context. And the majority of these populations are concentrated in developing countries of global south. The lack of capacity, equity, and adequate resources, coupled with the already existing development challenges in these regions, constrain their ability to mitigate as well as adapt to the uncertain climate risk. In the absence of strong efforts, the scenario is set to worsen even further. Now, there is a greater realization by all of us that fulfilling the climate pledges and ensuring a rapid transition to climate resilient economies and societies would require unprecedented efforts and reallocation of capital that significantly exceeds the capacities of the developing countries. Optimizing development co-benefits from simultaneous implementation of sustainable development goals and climate action, or rather, the intersection of climate and SDGs, is an essential and powerful solution for the success of Paris Agreement and 2030 Agenda. In this session, we will focus and deep dive on questions around one, an understanding of the need for adapting an intersectional lens to deal with the climate crisis, and B, mainstreaming the community needs into climate and development agenda of this region. We have a stellar lineup of panelists, beginning with Shobha Raha. Could I ask you guys to quickly introduce yourself before I move into the discussion?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Aparna, and thank you, everyone, for having me here. I'm Shobha Raha. I head new initiatives at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We are a Delhi-based think tank, and we specialize in using data and analytics to change and understand the use and reuse and misuse of resources. And that basically includes everything from energy to infrastructure to food, cooling, etc. We work across various streams. Related to this, we've done a lot of work on resilience, and we are also developing India's first climate risk atlas, so which I'll talk about a little bit when we come to that topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Can you hear me? Hi. So I'm Janelle, and I work with the MacArthur Foundation, based out of Delhi. And I co-manage the climate portfolio, joining the foundation in 2020. So my first gig at philanthropy. But at the same time, I co-manage the climate solutions big bet, and the name solutions is very important over there, which came into existence in 2015. The foundation has existed since 1993 in India. It's Chicago headquartered philanthropic foundation, and we have worked in the issues of conservation, sustainable development, population, reproductive health for 20 years before we started our work in climate in 2015. The approach had been pretty much around international leadership, that if 3 countries, India, US, and China, took ambitious pledges and was staying true to their pledges, the world will be in a better place. Of course, that did not happen. So we have shifted on our approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into that and how it embeds equity and inclusion in that. Thank you.
Thanks, Janelle. Can I move over to Suruchi? Suruchi, could you introduce yourself briefly?
Good morning. I'm Suruchi Bhatwal. I head the program on climate and air at TERI. We've been basically working on the issue of adaptation and building climate resilience for more than 2 decades now. In fact, TERI has been the first organization which developed the vulnerability profiling for the country as early as 2003. And we continue to dig deeper into related issues in terms of presenting our findings by way of different pieces of research that we undertake across different sectors covering agriculture, water resources, health, coastal regions, and forests and biodiversity.
Thank you. Could I ask Felicitas Von Peter to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning from Europe, from Berlin. I thought I'd bring you a little bit of forest into a conference room. My name is Felicity Von Peter, and I run and set up the Forum for Active Philanthropy. We support funders with developing strategies for how to act against the climate crisis.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. I'm Aparna. I lead the Climate Change and Development Program at Observer Research Foundation. And I also coordinate the task force on refueling growth and energy transition at the Think 20 Secretariat. So, Suruchi, I'd come to you first for your intervention. Please lay us in the understanding of what does intersectionality mean in the context of climate crisis, and why is there even a need to employ an intersectionality lens to address climate change? And then why is there a need for policy and programs and action to be aligned with the impact on vulnerable and marginalized community? Suruchi, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. Climate change poses huge risks and effects in the way it is basically being observed on both natural and human systems. And these impacts construe on different sections of the society. It varies across people, and therefore the whole angle of intersectionality becomes important in the discussion that we are having today. We do know that the way the climate impinges on societies, the poor and the marginalized sections of the society are likely to be affected differentially, and it's not the same as it affects all people across the board. Therefore, there is a need to understand and dig more deeper into how these impacts are construed and how people across the spectrum are likely to get affected differentially with regard to the impacts that we talk about. And we do know when we are talking about the impacts, we are talking about impacts that are related to heat wave conditions that are likely to be created, impacts of floods, flash floods, landslides, and health impacts. Also now we are linking issues of increased migration rates, which are environmentally induced, and looking at livelihoods that are dependent on these sectors. So all the more reason to try and get into each of these areas and understand how the impacts are differentially affecting different sectors of the society and people from where they stand. And therefore, I think, even on the adaptation work that we have done over the years, these are areas that have stood to be ignored, actually. So the depth of the investigations and the research have not been able to capture the intersectionalities that drive vulnerabilities within the system. And there is a clear need to basically understand what are those multiple levels of vulnerabilities that get created due to societal differences that exist. And we do feel that there is a need to have studies and research which basically focuses. So ideally, one would call it as ethnographic studies that need to be promoted, which gets into the behavioral aspects of these issues, as well as tries to understand who are the marginalized in the society, who need to be basically focused on with regard to the entire decision-making process. Now, when we see policies and plans being framed on the climate side, and even in the case of India, when we have our national action plans and national missions and the state action plans being framed, I don't think so we have gone into that depth of understanding how people are differentially affected and how different responses need to be created, targeting those who are poor, marginalized, and disadvantaged in the society. So therefore, there's a clear need now, while we have focused on adaptation and we focused on issues to build climate resilience on the surface, I think there's a clear need to basically focus on the intersectionalities now. We've reached at a certain level of understanding with regard to who are the poor, who are the disadvantaged. Now, within the poor and the disadvantaged, also to bring in the dissections in the society to be able to clearly say what are the requirements that need to be addressed, to be able to make sure that the capacities of the underprivileged are addressed adequately. So I think there are huge issues and complexities here that we're talking about once we bring in the intersectionality lens. And it is very less understood, if I may basically submit, in the context of the work we have still done within the country.
Thank you, Suruchi. And yes, we agree that there is a clear need for getting into the depth of understanding whose resilience should we build, who are vulnerable, the various levels at which the vulnerabilities are experienced. And I must mention here that which is why ORF and DASRA had now embarked into a project where we are doing a study to exactly explore the various impact of climate change on different sectors and how each of the system needs to build resilience, differential resilience against the uncertain risk of climate change. But Shubha, taking the point from what Suruchi mentioned, in your opinion, do you think that each of the countries across the global south are intentionally integrating climate action and sustainable development, climate actions and sustainability across their policies and programs?
So it's working. Okay. Yeah. So two parts to this. I want to go back to two things that we heard during the keynotes. One was Ms. Narain saying that we've got the transition conversation all wrong. And the second was Ms. Mountford saying that only 2% of philanthropic contribution or climate finance is coming into, or philanthropic finance is coming into the climate area, sustainable area. Now, what we need to understand is that even that 2% is not coming to the global south. It's all concentrated in the global north. So countries in the global south have started integrating the sustainability policies by default into their national systems, because we are operating within a very, very small carbon budget. So the pressure that came from outside to reduce emissions, etc., has kind of gone into the consciousness of these countries at a very early developmental stage, unlike developed countries, which are now kind of trying to retrofit sustainable solutions into it. So developing countries work already frugally because they have very limited resources. So then the integration of one very limited means to get sustainability, to use indigenous knowledge or traditional methods to get sustainability, these are all being built into our existing policy. But one problem is that, especially in the democracies of the South, these are very, very populous countries. And if you see the global South, unlike the global North to a large extent, they're very heterogeneous countries. So they develop, they're different size, geographies, demographics, political conditions, ideologies, the level of developedness of their populations. So there's a lot of customization that is required over here. You cannot have one size fits all. So a lot of the G20 conversation, and G20 has a very healthy mix of developed and emerging and developing economies, and you can, when you go into the negotiations, you see very, very different levels of understanding and perspective of the real situation. So when we say that we want to phase out fossil fuel subsidy, yes, in principle, on paper, of course, but the energy access point that Sunita Narain mentioned, I mean, if you phase out fossil fuel subsidy, then a very large proportion of this population will just lose basic access, and that's a very hard-earned gain. So where do we solve this wicked problem? So with certain things we need to do and certain things we would like to do, the must-haves and the good-to-haves have to be balanced. That said, I think India has taken some very bold steps. When we started the ISA, the Solar Alliance, it was a novel idea. It was something people hadn't done. It was a very sectoral idea. It was outside the UN. It was a very, very challenging environment to bring that in. We got support from France, and now it has about 114 member countries. CDRI, again, when we started, it was the Coalition for Disaster Resilience. It's again a new idea. So we have actually shown a lot of leadership, like I think somebody mentioned, Helen mentioned, in fact, that in creatively addressing global South solutions. So I think with the G20 taking up the disaster resilience work, the kind of issues we have inserted across the finance and Sherpa tracks for climate, for energy transition, for development working group, for de-risking projects, for MDB reforms, they have to be continued and they have to come together for specific global South solutions. I'm going to stop there.
Okay. So clear divide between the global South and global North. Janil, how do you think, I mean, how would you critically assess the philanthropic landscape of climate in the global South? And if there exists, what are the do you think the consideration of equity and inclusion is mainstreamed in this giving?
Thanks, Aparna. I feel that the name philanthropy itself sometimes makes us feel that equity and inclusion would be very central to whatever they do. But somehow that escaped our attention when we started working in the climate space in particular. It was all about the big things, the emissions, mitigation, the big picture, the systems. These are the jargons that we use, right? So it was all about, okay, the North and the South, the big and the small, the rich and the poor. And that's where I think people's perspectives got completely missed. And that's where I think philanthropy could have had a potential role, but hasn't had one yet. So I'll come to that a little later. And I'll talk a little bit about our journey over here. When we started back in 2015, it was all about these three countries, US, India, and China. Again, the big picture thinking that, okay, at the country level, at the national level, what can we do? And how can we get these countries to set ambitious international goals? But when we got onto the table to study what the impact has been in 2020, we figured out, and maybe earlier than that, we were observing that the outcomes that were coming as part of the international leadership, the submissions that these countries were doing at the UNFCCC were much less ambitious than what their domestic targets were. And that's where we kind of decoded the equation that, okay, it's the domestic targets which will drive the international leadership, not the other way around. It's not that a country like India would come to an international fora or international forum and make a commitment and then go back to the country and saying that, oh, we committed to UNFCCC, now we need to make ambitious policies. It was the other way around. So in 2020, we made a shift that we need to move away from, not move away completely, but in addition to international leadership, we would need to disproportionately focus on national domestic drivers of growth. And that's where Sunita mentioned about co-benefits. How does climate be a co-benefit as opposed to development being a co-benefit of climate work? So flipping the whole narrative around climate. And that's where we started programming at the sub-national level. So we looked at a few states, UP, Uttar Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, which are going to undergo a lot of transition or transformation, as Sunita mentioned. And I'll come back to the justice and equity piece also. Whenever we talk about justice or climate justice, it's all about the North and the South. Someone polluted, someone is bearing the brunt. Those people who did not pollute are bearing the brunt of it more than others. It's not just true about the North and the South, the Western countries and the developing countries. It's also something which is not climate justice for India. It's climate justice in India too. In India also, there is structural inequity and inequality, because of which some of our country folk pollute much more. And in India, we made many more dollar billionaires during the COVID period, as opposed to the past 2 decades. So there is inequity in the country too. So I think we need to acknowledge that fact that within India also, some people will gain more and some people will get left out of this whole transition. And that's where the subnational programming becomes important, wherein if you see this energy transition, states like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Gujarat, Maharashtra, they have been historically advanced states and they will gain more out of it. But states like Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, UP, West Bengal, Odisha, who have been out of the development picture because of historical resource curse, if I may say, they will get left out of it as well. So that's where equity and inclusion becomes very central. It is a wicked topic, as Shiva also said, but I don't think we have enough time to discuss that, but happy to talk more about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Janil. I'll now go to Dr. Felicita Peter. Dr. Peter, how does the climate crisis, according to you, affect philanthropists' funding portfolio? And what is the need to employ an intersectional climate lens on funding policies and these portfolios? And as we were talking about co-benefits here, my last sub-question to you would be, what are the co-benefits of employing this approach?
Thank you very much. I think I want to get back to what Helen was saying early on about the 2%, but also about the need to bring a broader lens to the climate question. Climate affects all areas of society, even those that normally are not identified with climate. So if you take health, for instance, India has the highest number of deaths attributed to air pollution globally. I think there were over 1 million deaths linked to polluted air in 2017, and that's grown. The same thing happens with education. The biggest factor affecting the brain is heat. So the more the crisis proceeds, the more schools will be impacted, the youth will be impacted. So I think what we need to do is to position climate in a different context, away a little bit from the scientific facts that sometimes dominates with, and to show how it impacts all areas of society and why we need to deal with not just climate, but climate in connection to other areas. We cannot solve climate without solving for poverty, without solving for injustice, as many have said. So I think what we need right now is most of all awareness. It's awareness about what is happening. It's awareness about where the world is going to develop into with the increasing climate crisis, and what the impacts will be on many other areas that we care for and that funders care for. So climate is not just a climate issue. Climate is a gender issue. Climate is a health issue. Climate is an education issue. And we see that philanthropists that often come to the table and they say, but I fund education. I cannot do anything about the climate crisis because I'm an education funder. They're not aware of what they can achieve actually when they use a climate lens. To me, it's a little bit like developing a new language. It's a little bit like seeing your world through the facts of the climate crisis and integrating this aspect into what you do anyway. And if we do, then we can also achieve a lot of added benefits. So the main question is, how will the world develop and how will that impact my portfolio, whether I'm funding women empowerment or I'm funding education? What will my school look like in 10 years when the climate crisis has progressed, and what does it mean for my portfolio and what I do? Now, foundations, I think, can do many different things, and we need to broaden the discussion beyond the usual suspects, the climate funders, and integrate others into that discussion. And foundations can, first of all, create awareness. So what DASRA is also doing with all the reports with this conference, it's to show a light, or to shine a light on the different topics that are connected to climate, and also to build infrastructure. I think foundations are very important to build infrastructure in the field for people to build bridges across these gaps of knowledge, of power, that we currently have. Another very important aspect that we can do is to bring the voices into the debate that have not been heard. I think the climate crisis becomes relevant when it's being told through stories from the people that are affected to people that normally are not in touch. So what we, for instance, do is we design these journeys into the field where we bring new climate funders or those that aspire to make a difference in direct contact with those either landscapes or also people that have been affected by the climate crisis. And I think foundations need to do a lot more of that, which also means we need testimonials, people who really talk about it, although it might still be new, and you might also brush it against some criticism. What I'm personally most afraid of is that climate is going to affect areas in our discussions that are truly important for our joint living together. It's going to polarize society a lot more because there's always this matter of who's created it and who's suffering. And I think we need to go beyond that discussion, not to leave that behind. It's very important to talk about who generated the emissions that caused the climate crisis, but to move more towards how can we jointly find solutions? And I think that's also why we need more bridges between the global north and the global south, because it's only together and by increasing action from the global south, supported by the north, that we really have any chance to make a difference.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. One of the very important points that Dr. Peter mentioned was that we cannot solve climate crisis without addressing the needs of the most vulnerable and the marginalized community. And therefore, it's so important to bring the voices of these communities who are in need to the fore and to international forums. So, Suruchi, my question to you is exactly this. How can we ensure that the voices of the marginalized communities or the vulnerable communities be integrated in the part of G20 and other international forums so that we can deepen the planning process with this kind of understanding?
Okay, So since this session focuses on intersectionality, I would just go back to that argument that when we get into the issue of looking at the intersectionalities and how they interact with societies, basically we do realize all the more in the climate change context that it restricts people's adaptive capacity and creates new or exacerbates existing vulnerabilities. So whatever vulnerabilities that we are talking about that exist and that get created because of the risks that are likely, they get further exacerbated when we start looking at the intersectionalities. And therefore they play out very differentially, and of course the solutions for it also have to be very differently structured. Why? Because decision making and power dynamics in societies vary a lot, and if that is not taken into account when you're forming solutions or forming policies, then possibly you're missing out on the whole agenda, and your solutions may not be holistic in the sense of being able to target the people who most need those solutions. So right now, if we were to look at how policies are structured and solutions are basically created around building resilience, they are very technocratic. Maybe some part of it addresses behavioral aspects, but all of these solutions that we talk about have something to do with the society. It has a societal aspect, right? When we are talking about building resilience. But however, because we have not looked into detail with regard to the intersectionalities on how these issues basically emerge, we have missed out with regard to addressing the real aspects of how people stand to be vulnerable, which are the disadvantaged groups that need to basically be targeted to be able to provide the solutions to them, to be able to make sure that they are not remaining behind, what I think was mentioned before, in the whole planning process that we move ahead with. I do feel that we still are limited in our understanding to capture the details of the inequities that exist in societies, and therefore we do not see them coming forth in our decision-making processes. They are right. Presently, they basically remain unaddressed, and therefore we need to find ways in the G20 process on how we can address these areas clearly. Possibly the G20 can insist for having more detailed analysis and research that basically can help policy making in the climate context, wherein disadvantaged groups are included, and it's a far more inclusive process which basically aims to address all forms and all types of people. It needs to be purposeful in its design and approach around social issues, addressing these inequalities and delving on various aspects surrounding issues of health, women, climate, businesses, etc., and a whole range of other areas where the G20 is having discussions. It also basically needs to make sure that these inequities are adequately addressed in the climate decisions that are basically being taken, to make sure that these sections of the society are equally considered in the whole process. And then, of course, the G20 also needs to basically focus on how to enhance understanding with regard to these inequities that get created, not only with regard to the North and the South, and it's also, within the South, trying to understand where do these inequities lie and how do these overlapping roles played by individuals at different levels get affected because of these concerns that we are talking about. And in the end, I think it has something to do with calling for deeper social reforms within countries and inclusivity within countries, which possibly the G20 can drive as an agenda.
Thank you. Thanks, Suruchi. Janelle, I'll come to you now. So, of course, to drive such agendas, there's a lot hinges on a effective multi-sectoral partnerships and multi-stakeholder collaborations. So what is the role of multi-stakeholder collaboration in accelerating climate action? And how can philanthropies, in particular in India and Global South, accelerate this intersectional climate action? And you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Aparna. I think there's nothing more intersectional than climate. It's said that climate affects everything and everything affects climate. So I think the details is in the devil is in the details, wherein thematically there has to be intersectoral planning for climate, and that's where we see the wedges approach that industry, energy, power sector, and now jobs as well. So these are intersectoral things that are happening. But I think you were mentioning more from an organizational point of view, institutional partnerships, and that's where I feel that. Of course, Neera mentioned about the Climate Rise Alliance, which is an amazing beginning to intersectionality, mainstreaming intersectionality in the climate debate. Of course, there are institutions like the India Climate Collaborative, which are bringing together domestic philanthropies to take part in this movement. Of course, domestic philanthropy has done a lot in the education, health, and other spaces, but I think that there's much more room to be more strategic in the climate space. I would also like to say, as I said, devil is in the details. Nuanced understanding of climate change in the country context is important. For instance, how does climate affect the brick sector, which is one of the major sectors for migrant laborers, for instance? How does the climate crisis affect the construction workers sector? How does it manifest in a state like Odisha, which has moved from the highest disaster-prone state to one of the most disaster-planned or zero death states? So how does mitigation or these sectoral collaborations happen within the larger resilience context at the state level? I think those are the things that we need to really flesh out as part of this discourse. Again, 2 minutes is not enough, but yeah, over to you, Shubha.
And I'll come to Shubha, but I'll quickly hear from Dr. Peter. I want to ask you, Dr. Peter, that how can international philanthropic commitments and pledges on climate action become more inclusive and intersectional? Very brief intervention from you on this.
Simply by opening up the room to include other voices. And I think one of the aspects that we haven't talked about in this panel is, I think we need to make very clear that the longer we wait to act, the more expensive it's going to be to act. So it's simply a question of economic and social and humanitarian logic to bring more action now. And for that to happen, we need to be more inclusive. We just need to have different voices in the room and different people taking the seat at the table. And we haven't done that so far. So I think it's about awareness. It's about joint discussions, because the solutions can only be jointly happening. And it's about seeing that there is no way out and making clear that we all know there is no way out to taking a bolder stance. You asked me to be very brief, so I'm trying to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. Shubha, again, a very brief intervention. You have been a part of our Think 20 Secretariat and have been representing CEEW in the processes of the task force. But what do you think? We have already crossed the midline now. How do you think can the G20 summit be leveraged to move the needle on climate action for the most vulnerable, to address the needs of the most vulnerable?
So 3 bullet points from my side. One, the fact that the G20 has picked up this issue, has mainstreamed it, because G20 is an economic body, right? It's not a UNF COP, which is a sort of a sectoral body for this topic. So now it's a part of these countries which control 80% of trade and 80% of GDP of the world. They have recognized that this is something that requires real attention and real money and real policy focus. That's something that we have to carry forth at mainstream platforms, not just climate forums. A second point is on the intersectionality of a different kind, which is between stakeholders. We spoke of multi-stakeholder, but I see gaps between government departments, the gaps between multilateral bodies. So even within stakeholders, there needs to be intersection. So a whole of government, whole of economy, whole of society approach. The third thing is very important to dissociate some of this from climate, such as transition or resilience needs to happen irrespective of the climate. I mean, there are more pressing reasons for each of us and all of our infrastructure and all of our food systems to be resilient, even if there was no climate change. So to box everything within the climate lens and to restrict it to climate finance is not sufficient. We need trillions of dollars. This is an economic transformation, a social transformation, and our vision needs to be expanded so that real project finance and real policy making can come into this space. Thank you.
So what I was doing actually is that in descending order with the allocation of time, I was preparing all of you for a rapid fire round. So yeah, before we end, I would just want to quickly ask my stellar panelists to think and put yourselves in the shoes of a G20 president, which India is right now, and just give us, say, one or two very quick important points on what do you think as the G20 president, India's message to the rest of the world be in mainstreaming intersectionality of climate and SDGs. So I'll start with Suruchi first. Suruchi, 2 points and very brief. This is rapid fire.
I'd actually go back to what we heard from Dr. Peter, have a more inclusive process in the discussion-making processes and have all voices heard.
Thank you very much. Dr. Peter?
We know it's time. We know it's happening. We can't negotiate with science, and the longer we wait, the more expensive it's going to get. And I would say, as the presidency, it would be great to get a very strong message also as to we are ready. We are ready to tackle the solutions, and we're ready to play our part. And now the North needs to play its part as well.
Thank you very much. Shiva.
India's message is encapsulated in the concept of life, I would say lifestyle for environment, where we are saying that your life, your choices, and the environment are not exclusive to each other. We can live a good life, a good quality of life, and it should have jobs and growth and sustainability for all within the construct of our relationship with nature. And we need to understand that we need to do this for self-preservation. And this can be done within an economic construct. It does not have to be an either or choice.
Great. Janelle.
I think India will be the first country, first major economy to develop in this era. So that's where we have a huge opportunity to reinvent development or redefine development. And the message should be India flourishing, not at the cost of climate, but with the climate crisis as a tailwind to it.
So all our panelists, I mean, 2 of our panelists are here. I would want to end the session now. Anybody who wants to bilaterally have a conversation, please feel free to reach out. And thank you very much for being so patient. Thank you.